The morning sun painted the Sahel in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the construction site where Captain Ibrahim Traore stood, his weathered hands gripping the architectural plans. The sound of hammers rang like ancestral drums across the landscape, each strike echoing the heartbeat of a nation awakening from centuries of slumber. "Baba, they say we cannot do this," whispered Aminata, his chief engineer, her voice carried by the harmattan wind. She spoke in Moor, the language of their ancestors, the words flowing like water over ancient stones. The Americans laugh. The Chinese calculate. But neither believes in the vision. Traore's eyes, dark as the Niger River at midnight, never left the horizon where the railway would soon stretch like an iron thread connecting the soul of Burkina Faso to its destiny. "My daughter," he said, his voice carrying the weight of griots who had sung stories for 1,000 years, "they measure us by the scars they left, not by the strength that remains." The $125 million project had become more than infrastructure. It was resurrection. Each rail tie laid was a prayer, each section of track a declaration that Africa would no longer be the world's afterthought. The train would be the fastest on the continent, cutting through the heart of the Sahel like lightning through storm clouds. In the village of Yako, where the baobab trees stood like ancient sentinels, the elders had gathered to discuss the iron snake that would soon cross their ancestral lands. The palavers began at sunset as they had for generations, with the pouring of libations and the calling of ancestors. "Yamba, spirit of the railway," old Mamadou intoned, his voice cracked like dried earth waiting for rain. "We call upon you to guide this metal beast, to make it serve our children, not devour them." The firelight danced across weathered faces, each line telling stories of colonial exploitation, of mines that had enriched distant capitals while leaving their people with dust and promises. But tonight, something different flickered in their eyes, hope, fragile as a newborn's breath, but growing stronger with each word spoken. Young Fatima, barely 16 but wise beyond her years, stood to address the circle. "The white man's railway took our gold, our fathers, our dignity. But this railway, this is ours." Captain Traore speaks with the voice of Mogo Naba, the ancient kings who never bowed. The wind carried her words across the savannah, where construction crews worked through the night, their songs mixing with the sound of machinery. These were not foreign workers brought to build another monument to external power, but sons and daughters of the soil, their calloused hands shaping the future with steel and determination. 3,000 miles away, in a glass tower that scraped the Washington sky, Secretary of State Margaret Harrison studied satellite images of the Burkina Faso railway project. The photographs revealed a truth that made her stomach tighten. This wasn't just construction, it was transformation. "Sir, the intelligence suggests this project is moving faster than anticipated," she reported to President Williams, her voice carrying the practiced neutrality of diplomatic service. "If successful, it could shift the entire balance of influence in West Africa." The president's fingers drummed against the oak table, a rhythm that spoke of anxiety rather than confidence. How is a country that most Americans couldn't find on a map suddenly building infrastructure that makes our own railways look like relics? Meanwhile, in Beijing, Minister Chen Wei stood before a wall-sized map of Africa, red pins marking every Chinese investment, every port, every railway built with careful strings attached. But there, in the heart of West Africa, a new line appeared, one that bore no Chinese signature, no familiar marks of dependency. "Comrade," his aide ventured carefully, "perhaps we underestimated the indigenous capacity for development." Chen's laugh was bitter as winter tea. Indigenous capacity? These people barely had electricity a generation ago. Someone is helping them. Someone who understands that control of African infrastructure means control of African futures. The rains came early that year, turning the construction site into a sea of red mud that seemed to swallow hope itself. Western media descended like vultures, their cameras capturing every setback, every delay, every moment of doubt that flickered across Traore's face. "Captain," called out James Morrison, CNN's West Africa correspondent, his voice cutting through the downpour. "Critics say this project is another example of African overreach. What do you say to those who claim you're building a monument to failure?" Traore paused, water streaming from his cap, his boots planted firmly in the mud that had tried to claim so many dreams before. When he spoke, his voice carried the thunder of the storm itself. "Monsieur Morrison, your great-grandfather built railways across America when men said it was impossible. He pushed iron through mountains, across deserts, through the tears of indigenous peoples. You call that vision. When we build railways through our own land, with our own hands, for our own people, you call it overreach." The journalist's pen stopped moving. Around them, Workers continued their labor, their songs rising above the sound of rain, voices that had learned to find rhythm in resistance. But sir, Morrison pressed, the technical challenges, the financial constraints. Monsieur, Traore's voice was soft now, dangerous in its quietness. You speak of constraints to a people who built the University of Timbuktu when your ancestors were painting their faces blue. You speak of impossibility to descendants of kingdoms that traded gold when London was a swamp. As the months passed, something extraordinary began to happen. The railway project became a catalyst, awakening talents that had slumbered under decades of imposed limitations. Young engineers emerged from universities that the world had dismissed, their minds sharp as the tools they wielded. Salif, a 25-year-old graduate from the University of Ouagadougou, stood before the project's technical committee presenting innovations that made seasoned contractors pause and wonder. His design for the track coupling system would reduce maintenance costs by 40% while increasing speed efficiency. "Barca, my brothers," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "we have been told we are good for digging minerals but not for building machines. Today we prove that the same hands that can extract gold from the earth can also lay the foundation for our children's prosperity." The room erupted in applause, but more than that, in recognition. These were not borrowed ideas adapted for local conditions. These were innovations born from understanding the land, the climate, and the unique challenges of the Sahel. Sister Marie-Claire, a nun who had spent 30 years in rural development, watched from the back of the room, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I have seen them build water pumps from scraps," she whispered to her companion. "I have seen them solve problems that defeated European engineers. But the world never asked them to build railways. The world never believed they could." Deep in the corridors of power, whispers became plans and plans became action. The railway project had become too successful, too inspiring, too dangerous to the established order of dependence. In a windowless room in Langley, Virginia, Deputy Director Richards studied files that painted a picture of African Renaissance. "If this railway succeeds," he told his assembled team, "it's not just transportation, it's a statement. Other countries will follow. The whole aid dependency model collapses." The plan was subtle, as the best plans always are. Economic pressure, carefully timed infrastructure failures, media campaigns that would turn success into scandal. But they had underestimated the power of a people who had learned to read between the lines of history. Back in Ouagadougou, Captain Traore sat in his modest office, surrounded by maps and letters. One letter, from a source he couldn't name, warned of bank freezes, of supply chain disruptions, of a coordinated effort to strangle the project in its cradle. "Mogo Naba," he whispered to the photograph of the traditional ruler on his wall, "give us the wisdom of our ancestors who faced the colonial armies with nothing but courage and unity." As external pressure mounted, something beautiful began to emerge from the shadows. Communities that had been divided by colonial borders, by ethnic tensions carefully cultivated through generations of divide and rule policies, began to unite around the railway project. In Kaya, market women contributed their savings, coins counted in cups, bills folded in colorful cloth, the accumulated wealth of small transactions that represented enormous sacrifice. Madame Bibata, her head wrapped in indigo cloth that spoke of ancient dyeing traditions, stood before the collection box. "These rails will carry our children to universities," she declared, her voice carrying the authority of motherhood. "They will carry our goods to markets where we set the prices. They will carry our stories to the world, told in our own voices." The scene was repeated across the region. Fulani herders, Mossi farmers, Bobo craftsmen, people whose differences had been weaponized by colonial administrators, now stood together, their contributions creating a fund that no international bank could freeze, no foreign government could control. The Chinese response was swift and calculated. A delegation led by Minister Chen Wei arrived in Ouagadougou with an offer that would have been irresistible just months before. Complete financing for the railway project, Chinese engineers, Chinese workers, Chinese control. "Captain Traore," Chen said, his voice smooth as silk, "we understand your desire for independence. But pragmatism demands partnership. We can complete your railway in half the time at half the cost." Traore sat across from the delegation, his hands folded, his expression unreadable. Behind him, the walls displayed photographs of the construction progress. African faces, African hands, African dreams taking shape in steel and concrete. "Minister Chen," he replied, his voice carrying the patience of centuries, "you speak of partnership, but your partnerships have a curious habit of producing asymmetric results. Your railways in Kenya, your ports in Djibouti, they serve Chinese interests first, African interests second. Chen's smile faltered. Captain, you cannot seriously believe that African resources, human and material, can compete with Chinese efficiency. Monsieur, Traore's voice hardened, you make the same mistake your predecessors made. You see our resources, our gold, our uranium, our youth, but you do not see our capacity. Today we choose to reveal that capacity to ourselves first, then to the world. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning when the first section of track was completed and tested. The locomotive, assembled in workshops that had previously repaired bicycles and motorcycles, rolled forward with a sound like thunder across the awakening earth. Children from nearby villages ran alongside the track, their laughter mixing with the rhythmic pounding of wheels on rails. This was not just a test run, it was a declaration that the impossible had become inevitable. International media, which had arrived expecting to document failure, found themselves witnessing something unprecedented. The BBC's correspondent, Sarah Matthews, struggled to maintain her professional composure as she reported live from the scene. What we're seeing here challenges every assumption about African development, she said, her voice betraying wonder despite her training. This railway, built largely with local resources and expertise, is not just meeting international standards, it's exceeding them. The train speed trials revealed a truth that sent shockwaves through planning departments in Washington and Beijing. At 250 kilometers per hour, it was indeed the fastest railway in Africa, built at a fraction of the cost of comparable projects elsewhere. That evening, as celebrations filled the streets of Ouagadougou, Traore found himself alone at the construction site, walking the length of track that had cost so much effort, so much faith. The stars above seemed brighter, as if the ancestors themselves were celebrating. Baba, came a voice from behind him. Aminata approached, her engineering helmet replaced by a traditional head wrap, her face glowing with accomplishment. The people are saying you have awakened the sleeping giant of Africa. Traore smiled, but his eyes remained fixed on the horizon. My daughter, I have awakened nothing. I have simply reminded our people that the giant was never asleep, only forced to pretend to slumber while others looted our dreams. The wind carried the sound of distant drums, traditional rhythms that had survived centuries of suppression. Tonight, they beat not in sorrow but in triumph, calling ancestors to witness what their descendants had achieved. 6 months later, the railway was operational, carrying passengers and goods across the Sahel with efficiency that made established railway companies take notice. But more than that, it had become a symbol of what was possible when African talent was allowed to flourish without the constraints of low expectations. The economic impact was immediate and profound. Travel time between major cities dropped from hours to minutes. Farmers could transport their produce to markets while it was still fresh. Students could attend universities without leaving their home regions. The railway had become an artery of possibility, pumping life into economic ventures that had previously been impossible. International investors, who had once dismissed African infrastructure projects as charity cases, began to arrive with serious proposals. But they found a changed landscape, negotiations conducted on equal terms, with African expertise no longer dismissed as inadequate. Success, like water finding its level, began to spread. In Ghana, a young engineer named Kwame studied the Burkina Faso railway project, adapting its innovations for a coastal environment. In Nigeria, ministers who had automatically turned to foreign contractors began to ask difficult questions about domestic capacity. The African Union, long criticized as a forum for empty rhetoric, found itself hosting technical conferences where African solutions to African problems were discussed with the seriousness previously reserved for foreign expertise. President Komu of Zimbabwe, addressing the AU summit, spoke words that captured the continental mood. For too long we have been told that African problems require non-African solutions. Today, Burkina Faso shows us that African solutions to African problems are not just possible, they are superior. But established powers do not surrender influence without a fight. The campaign to undermine the railway project's success took new forms. Environmental concerns raised by organizations that had remained silent about more destructive projects, human rights questions from institutions that had ignored decades of exploitation, economic sustainability doubts from banks that had profited from keeping Africa in debt. The most insidious attacks came through familiar channels. African intellectuals, educated in Western universities, who had internalized the belief that African solutions were inherently inferior. Professor Kofi Mensah, speaking at a conference in London, provided the academic veneer for continued dependency. While we celebrate the technical achievement, he said, his accent polished by years at Oxford, We must ask whether this railway represents sustainable development or merely African pride masquerading as progress. His words, broadcast across international media, found fertile ground among those who preferred their African success stories to remain modest, grateful, and ultimately dependent. But the most powerful response came from an unexpected source: the children of the villages along the railway line. In schools that had previously taught from textbooks describing distant achievements, teachers found themselves able to point to the railway and say, "This is what we can build." 8-year-old Fatou, in her essay about the railway, wrote words that would be quoted in newspapers across Africa. "The train is not just made of metal. It is made of the dreams of our grandparents, the work of our parents, and the hope of our children. When I grow up, I will build rockets because if we can build trains, we can build anything." Her teacher, Madame Cohn, had tears in her eyes as she read the essay to the class. These children, unlike their parents, would grow up believing that African achievement was normal, expected, inevitable. The railway's success had implications that extended far beyond Africa. In boardrooms across the developed world, assumptions about global development that had persisted for decades began to crumble. The aid industry, built on the premise of African incapacity, found itself facing an existential crisis. Dr. Patricia Williams, head of the Institute for Development Studies in London, found herself having to revise decades of research. "We may have fundamentally misunderstood the relationship between capacity and opportunity," she admitted in a paper that sent shockwaves through the development community. The railway had become more than infrastructure. It was evidence of capabilities that had been dismissed, ignored, or actively suppressed. The implications were staggering. If Burkina Faso could build world-class railways, what other impossible achievements were actually just waiting for the right conditions? As the first anniversary of the railway's opening approached, Captain Traore stood once again at the construction site, now transformed into a bustling station. The sound of the trains arriving and departing had become part of the rhythm of daily life, as natural as the call to prayer or the evening drums. "Mogo Naba," he whispered to the wind, "we have kept faith with the ancestors. We have shown the world that the children of Africa can build anything, achieve anything, become anything." The train pulled into the station, its sleek form a testament to African engineering, its passengers a symbol of African mobility, its very existence a declaration that the age of imposed limitations was ending. As the sun set over the Sahel, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, the railway stretched into the distance like a promise kept, a dream realized, a future assured. The iron thread had become a lifeline, connecting not just cities but possibilities, not just regions but realities. The revolution had begun not with guns or manifestos, but with rails and dreams, with the simple but profound act of believing that African solutions to African problems were not just possible, they were inevitable. In the distance, the sound of drums mixed with the rhythm of wheels on rails, creating a symphony of the old and the new, the traditional and the modern, the dreams of ancestors and the achievements of their children. The railway had become more than transportation. It was transformation, proof that when Africa dared to dream for itself, those dreams could indeed become reality. The iron thread stretched toward tomorrow, carrying with it the hopes of a continent that had remembered how to build its own destiny, one rail at a time, one dream at a time, one achievement at a time. The sleeping giant had awakened, and the world would never be the same.